Welcome all. And I'm talking to you from Wiradjuri land, uh, in view of a mountain called Gilligalliambula. The English people named it Mount Walker. It's a place of for men's um, training and that sort of thing. So I just wanted you all to think about what in your area can you be grateful for because of the Aboriginals who have cared for the land for centuries? I know here the beauty that they've not destroyed, especially Mount Walker.
Mm.
So I want to acknowledge those elders, past and those present, and those that are emerging for the care that they've given for the land and encourage all of us to continue caring for the land around us. I'd also like to start with a prayer. So if you'll join me. God, I thank you for this time when we can gather, that we can enjoy each other's company, but we can also learn. I pray that you'd be with Matt and that we can learn things about how to communicate and work at solving issues together as a group. We just thank you for your Holy Spirit that will be with us and the life of Jesus that lived before us. And we praise you. Amen.
So, Matt Clarke is our speaker today, and I think everybody on here should know who Matt is. Researcher, scholar, book writer. If you haven't seen these two, Scattering Church and Disrupting Mercy. Um, Also recently won some kind of award for from a human rights group or a trafficking group. You can talk a little bit more about that, Matt. But also AAANZ president, and his topic today, let me get the right one, purpose and process of consensus decision making. So Matt and Bella have a newsletter that they put out about their work on human trafficking. So I don't know if you want to put that in the chat box for anybody that wants to get that and keep up with the work that you do outside of AAANZ. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'll put a link to our website when we're later in discussion mode and I've got a moment to think and find the link. Look, yeah, and thanks for bringing up the award. I'm not very good at the self-promotion bit, but I was presented with an Influential Scholar Award from the 21st International Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference just a couple of weeks ago. So that's a great confirmation of the importance of the work that we've been doing in anti-trafficking over the last few years. I don't know that I did a great more than so many others do in that field, but our approach to restorative justice and taking account of the perpetrator's side of the problem is a bit controversial, and it's nice to have that recognised positively. So thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen with some PowerPoint slides on this topic of consensus. And that one. So, can you see a PowerPoint slide now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cool. Thank you. This topic of consensus decision making has often struck me as an important part of Christian community, and it's an idea that's rarely put into practice, and even more rarely put into practice well. And so I wanted to think about, what does consensus mean? Why would we want to do it? What's its place in Anabaptist tradition? And then how might it actually work in practice? So the outline for the discussion here is these 5 points here, and I'll say a few words about the first couple of points, and then we'll have a discussion for a while, and then I'll talk a bit about the more practical side, the process, and how it might work within the AAANZ and within our own spheres of influence, and we'll have some more discussion at the end. So that's the direction where we're going. I thought I'd start with a few quotes that I've just picked up and heard. Just about how people use the word consensus. the general consensus is the boss is an idiot, or the group agreed by consensus to something or other, or the consensus among scientists is such and such. Some things we recognize we have no consensus about. So there's a wide variety of usage of that word consensus. It's partly a process. It's a process for coming to agreement, and it's partly a noun. It's the goal of having agreement. So consensus can be both process and intended outcome. And sometimes for some people, consensus just means the majority voice, the common opinion. And for other people, consensus means more specifically unanimity, that everyone is in total agreement of one mind. So the word gets used in various ways, and as most words in any language, we just have to work with that. It doesn't just have one definition. I used a Google feature called Ngram. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Google has access to a huge historical library of books going back a couple of hundred years. And through analyzing those books, it's got a search facility. You can look up any word. And this graph shows us the frequency of usage of the word consensus since 1900. And you see that from 1960, it started to be used a lot more. And it's maybe plateaued out in the last 10, 20 years. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, the word was used by a lot of hippie protest movements as people decided that the traditional way of majority rule wasn't really working and we wanted to try something new. And so people tried to work harder at coming to agreement with each other about important decisions. If we just compare that with another word, so you get an idea of the magnitude of this, I thought let's compare the frequency of the word consensus with the frequency of the word internet. You can see after 1990, the word internet took off. But in general, the word internet today is used just a little bit more frequently than the word consensus. So, consensus is quite a highly used word in the last 20 years. At that point of crossover, 2015, if you can picture yourself back in 2015, the words internet and consensus were used at roughly about the same amount of time in written work that Google had access to. So I thought that was interesting. Let's look at a couple more targeted definitions rather than general usage. The Britannica Dictionary says consensus is a general agreement about something. Doesn't mean complete agreement. It says there a general agreement about something, an idea or opinion that is shared by all people in the group. Well, that's a bit contradictory. Is it a general agreement or is it all people? Well, it's somewhere in there. The Uniting Church has a definition, and I choose the Uniting Church because they've done a significant amount of work on consensus. All councils within the Uniting Church of Australia are encouraged, not required, but encouraged to use consensus in all their decisions. And according to the Uniting Church Manual for Meetings, consensus is a process by which a common mind of the meeting is sought. Doesn't say it's always achieved, but it's sought about the wisest way forward on a particular issue at the time. Consensus decisions can change. They're not rules set in stone. It's a process trying to reach a common mind. It's an intention that's sought rather than an absolute requirement on a particular issue for a particular time. I thought those are reasonably good definitions that we can work with. Next, I thought I'd say a little bit about the role of consensus in Anabaptist praxis. And the word praxis is a combination of ideas, ideology, theory, and practice. It's how your ideas get put into practice within a group. And Anabaptist praxis has often included something like consensus. It's listened to everyone in the group and tried to communally discern what God would have us believe and do. So the communal discernment process that is a cornerstone of traditional Anabaptism and modern day Anabaptism and neo-Anabaptism tries to listen to each other and seek God together so that we can be of one mind. Now, it's interesting when I thought about the biblical example here that I don't think Jesus practiced consensus. Jesus, in his relationship with his disciples and others, didn't say, now let's all talk about this and see if we can all come to an agreement before we do anything. He was much more the type of leader who told his followers what was happening, what to expect, the reasons behind things, and directed them to do things. So it's interesting that Jesus plays a special role there. If we consider the Trinity, then we might theologically say, well, within the Trinity there is consensus, there is unanimity, the three persons in the Trinity are of one mind. And so that's a possible example for us of how consensus works. But in general, we don't look to Jesus for a direct example of how to do consensus. Nevertheless, his followers picked up the idea of consensus quite early on, and various New Testament writers encourage us to be of one mind, to have the mind of Christ, to agree with each other. And so there's a sense of egalitarianism in the New Testament that honors all people, that we are all equally made in God's image, that everyone is a priest, that we are all called in Christ to be a new priesthood, that we should all listen to each other and serve each other as part of one body. Paul uses that metaphor of the body, and if you read the way he presents that idea of the church, the followers of Jesus as a body, it underscores this idea of egalitarianism, that we all have a collective responsibility. We're all part of it. We all cooperate. We have different roles, but there's a sense of unity because we are one body in Christ. And Paul notes that, look, our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. And so that's quite different than a modern majority rules sort of system that we're used to in our meetings and used to in our democratic government, where the minority is overruled by the majority. The less respectable are ignored. They're further marginalized as not having a real value in the communal decision making. So Paul's idea of the body and this sense that we're all equal in God's sight provided early Anabaptists with the idea that we ought to honor each other by listening even to the dissenting minority. The early church practiced something like this. You can think of examples like in Acts 6, when the certain widows weren't getting assisted equally, and so the gathered church decided that they should nominate some people specifically to serve the widows, and that was done by a process of 12 people being selected. And it's said there in Acts 6 that not 12 people being selected, but by the 12 apostles, the followers of Jesus, including who replaced Jacob? Who replaced Judas? Matthias. The 12 put forward some people, and that pleased the whole community. That was an important thing for Luke to note in Acts, that a decision was made by some leaders with a designated role, but it was passed by the whole community and it pleased everybody. They were all in agreement with it. In Acts 15, there was an important council about how the young church ought to interact with Gentiles. And the quote that I've got here, the apostles and the elders, with the consent of the whole church, decided on a certain course of action. So it's not clear if that's the full kind of consensus that some people try to practice today, where we won't do anything until everyone agrees. But there's certainly this sense that everyone's opinion is important and that the best opinions are made where we're all behind it. In Anabaptist praxis, one of the crucial things that separated early Anabaptists from the other reformers was this belief that we should all live according to our individual conscience, that nobody's conscience should be overwhelmed, overridden, that we shouldn't force decisions on people by the nature of their birth or their citizenship. And that was one of the key reasons why the early Anabaptists didn't want to baptize infants, because that was imposing something that the person hadn't agreed to by their individual conscience. And so we respect the choices of others. And right from the beginning, the Anabaptist communities refused to coerce people, understanding that membership of the church was voluntary, it wasn't automatic. It wasn't something that you were stuck with, but you chose to be a follower of Jesus and a member of the church. And according to your own conscience, you had to decide what that meant about how you should live. And therefore, we cannot impose our decision on somebody else. That means if we want to be together as a community, we must all come to a common view, rather than the majority imposing their view on a dissenting minority. The idea of communal discernment, that together we listen, and we listen to God, we listen to each other, we read the scripture, we pray, we listen to the Holy Spirit, and it's together that we find the word of God, the will of God in a particular circumstance, in a particular gathering. That's quite distinct from an institutional or hierarchical discernment method where the bishop, the minister, the pastor, the pope, or the rules of the denomination tell us what we must believe and do. And it's also much different than individual discernment, where everybody has access to God and you can read the Bible yourself and you pray yourself and find out what God wants for you as an individual. This communal discernment that honors every person in a community to the extent that we listen to each other and that we allow the voice of God to speak even through a dissenting minority is quite different to either of those extremes, the institutional or the individual. There's a belief in this context that God often disrupts the status quo by speaking from the margins. If we go by a decision-making process where majority rules, then we're nearly always reinforcing the status quo. It's very hard to make a new disruptive decision if it's majority rules, or if it's just living according to the rule that's already been written according to tradition or according to some leaders who dictate what the followers must do. If we think that God speaks from the margins, then it means we must pay particular attention to the voice from the margins. You see plenty of biblical examples of this, even the extreme example in Numbers 22, where Balaam was talked to by his donkey, that God spoke through the donkey to prevent Balaam doing the wrong thing. The lone prophetic voice that we see in the Old Testament prophets, crying in the wilderness, that lone voice is actually the voice of God. In the New Testament, the children crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David, were the ones who brought God's view in amongst a crowd who were largely opposed to Jesus. The widow's mite is another example. The marginalized widow putting in a couple of cents into the temple collection jar was honored by Jesus, given special attention, partly because she was the marginalized that nobody else paid attention to. The centurion whom Jesus, who called to Jesus to heal a sick child or a sick servant, it's not quite clear which, and Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." And so again, there's this voice from the margins, a Gentile, a Roman centurion, one of the oppressors, who Jesus affirmed had great faith. And so through all of these examples, I think we see that if we pay attention to the marginalized, to the lone voice, to the dissenting opinion, we are likely to hear something new that disrupts the status quo. And in fact, it might be the good news from God. I put a reference down the bottom to a book by Art Gish, which is one of my favorite books on Anabaptist praxis. And it's available completely free at that site, archive.org, which is an amazing website, by the way. It's got a huge library of old material that you can borrow electronically in the same way as you would borrow from a library. I recommend that chapter, The Discerning Community. Okay, now I think I'm going to pause. I'm going to do one more slide and then we'll pause for some discussion. With all that as sort of background, I'll pose this question: what is the intention? What's the purpose? Why would we want to do consensus? And the answers here come from this, certainly a Christian perspective, which might be different. There's no reason why people of no faith can't do consensus, but they probably have slightly different reasons for doing so. But I'm trying to draw attention here to the reasons that come out of our Christian and Anabaptist context about why we might consider using a consensus decision-making process. The first is that consensus is built on the idea that we want to seek the wisdom of God, and that we can do that best by doing it as a worshipping community. It also relies on this idea that it's not just the final decision that's important. It's not just the goal, the end of the process, but the means, how you come to that decision, which is also important. And so consensus provides a process that honors all, that respects all, that is deeply listening. And that process itself is something that builds community, that builds faith, that builds our dependence on God, and it builds practices within our lives that are reflective of the kingdom of heaven, the value that Jesus aspired, that Jesus calls us to in the kingdom of heaven. It honors that everyone who's present, even if they are completely disrespected by everybody else. It avoids dominance. It avoids anyone or any group of people domineering, coercing, and imposing their will on somebody else. It breaks down the power of hierarchies. It brings everyone along. It gives everyone a voice so that everyone feels heard, and hopefully everyone is committed to the decision at the end of the process. It avoids majority rules, and it avoids that endorsement of the status quo that would normally come just by doing what the majority says. It values minority opinion because we believe that the minority opinion might, not always, but might just be where God is trying to say something new to us. Right, now I'm going to stop sharing and ask for some shared discussion. Maybe if you'd like to start, what's your past experience of consensus? Has it been positive or negative? Have you got any questions or disagreements with the way I've presented the core ideas behind consensus? What's your experience? Mary.
Oh, I was just putting my didn't have anything to say quite yet, but I've been involved in consensus in a variety of spaces, churches and other work that Mark and I have done. So, and usually it's been very, very good if we take the time to listen to each other. There are times when people want to railroad the thing, and so getting them back to consensus is the struggle. Right.
Yeah, unless everyone's committed to the consensus process and understands it, it's still possible for people to railroad, and yeah, that's a challenge.
As many of you know, I was part of the Mennonite Church in Houston, Texas for 10 plus years. And so a lot of decisions there were consensus focused. And one in particular comes to mind in terms of what you've been saying, Matt. And it was the decision a number of years ago by the congregation on whether to become an open and affirming congregation for LGBTQ+. And so that was the format was at least as important as the decision in the way that was done. And that really resonated with what you said about it forces you to do things a different way. I think that's really true. The process took, from memory, the better part of a year, possibly over a year, and was very carefully structured with readings and meetings and time for people to speak and table groups. And it was very carefully crafted. And one piece that wasn't just for this process, but again, for this example, that I really liked about it was a lot of decisions had 4 choices that you could come to when they would do these straw polls before there was a binding poll, and just getting the temperature of what people were thinking. And the choices were always, I disagree with the decision. I disagree, but I will go with what the community, the majority of the community feels. I agree, but we'll go with the majority, and I agree. No caveats. And I really found that interesting too, that even within the votings, it wasn't voting per se, but when you were giving your choice, you could vote in some measure for consensus. That was part of what you were saying, that I feel this way about this, whatever the the question was, but I also feel this way about the body, about the community. And I found that really interesting and helpful. And like I said, the way it structured, it forced us in a good way to structure things and listen to one another and have all that as part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, thanks. Lucy.
I've had a very interesting life journey with a lot of different Christian denominations through either my personal faith walk, depending where I was geographically located, or through a bit later in my life, a lot of interdenominational kinds of ministry entities. And just across the board there, I've found with actual individual local expressions of church, depending on what, denomination that they ascribe to, there isn't a lot of consensus in the sense of you've described it, of coming to common opinion, one heart and one mind. It is generally more hierarchical. But say, for example, in the creative arts sphere that I've involved with the particular entity, consensus is really important, of trying to get 100% agreement if we can, or as you said, particular issues at particular times. Sometimes, the majority rule, in a sense, carries, and that is often reflected in constitutions of various associations or organisations, or even movements, as we like to call progressive Christian entities now, group entities. And I think in the social justice kind of sphere, in my experience, you're more likely to get a listening to the marginalised voices and having that goal of consensus. So I'm reading an amazing book at the moment by Alan Hirsch, the missiologist, about metanoia, it's called. It's about, that word, the Greek word that means repentance, but it's about individual and organisational change process. And that is really amazing. And I think this idea of that consensus, or the one heart, the one mind, and very, very practical steps of how to achieve something that is really difficult. So, so thanks for the way you've described it, and thanks for the tips on some of the internet, I'm using that word as well as consensus, the internet references that you have made that can help us if we want to research things.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah. Anyone else like to say something about their experience of consensus?
A couple of things come to mind. Being part of the Baptist Association, New South Wales and ACT, there's been, quite a big, a big decision to make. A big decision made, and it's been passed by 80-odd% of the churches that attend the annual meetings, or the association meetings, to require churches to to sign up to that marriage is between a man and a woman for life. Now, so that's mainly targeting the LGBTQ community, but it's also by ramification is targeting divorced people to a lesser extent. I think they're trying to get around that because, they've come to the agreement that they will actually the vote to kick out a church if they don't is 51%. They only require 51% of the meeting to actually excommunicate a church. It was at 75 and they brought it back to 51%. So that's rather sad. In the throes of that, Janine and I decided we would have to leave Narrabeen the Narrabeen Baptist Church and join Avalon. And we still keep in contact with our friends there, but we've moved to Avalon. So there's not much consensus there. The other side of the issue is that when an issue comes up within a church, and you might have one person saying, which might be quite unreasonable. I think you do have to get to the point where you have to say, look, we've talked about this long enough. There is consensus in everyone but the one person, and I'm sorry, we just can't continue going over this particular issue. And it may be maybe that person may have some sort of psychological character issue that they just can't agree with anything. And so I think you need the wisdom to actually a consensus of the people that all agree that you need the wisdom to say, well, okay, enough's enough. We have to move on.
Mm-hmm.
But
right.
Just another thing.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more of that in terms of the practicalities of the process. Danny, did you want to say something there?
So mine isn't within a church setting, so it's a secular setting, which is where I used to work before I retired. And one thing that I did was model within the management team that I created a consensus approach, and also extended that to the teams that I ran. And I ran it across 3 sites. So I had about 40 staff and across Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. So the logistics were a bit difficult in terms of managing that sort of thing.
Mm.
But what I did find though, and most of the people found it difficult to come to terms with a consensus style, as did other managers in the organisation that I worked in, because even though this was public service we're talking about, and we're supposed to be open to all sorts of things, the reality is that we're not. You've got people that are very hierarchical in their approach in that. And part of my difficulty I would find is that there would be a lot of disagreement with my approach. But then I would just say, well, look at our statistics. We outperform everyone else in the department. And I would get a lot of pushback because a lot of people would be quite negative that we weren't falling down in some respects. And what I found interesting, though, is that even though I adopted a secular approach, I didn't use Christian language or anything like that because that wouldn't be appropriate anyway. Most of the pushback I got was actually from other Christians that opposed me on a lot of things. And I must say, within my workspace, most of the Christians didn't like me anyway. They always thought that I was socialist, ratbag, feminist, all sorts of things. But I did find that you can translate this sort of thing into a secular context, and it's worth doing in that regard. And I had to think through how would I do this, but it was rooted in my understanding of, Anabaptism, the importance of consensus, the importance of listening to the minority voice, and that's why I included staff in discussion as well. So even though it wasn't pure consensus, because you really can't do that, I tried to implement as much as possible, really, and it worked quite well. And I was able to do that for about 20 odd years, so that was pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's quite an
a lot
achievement.
doing that.
I think that's quite an achievement. Yeah, well done. Well done. Yeah. Okay, now let's move on to some more practical matters. I'm going to share my screen again and show a couple more slides and we'll have some more discussion. Right, so there's some important assumptions or foundations that go before a consensus process is going to get off the ground or be effective. One of the most important is, I think there needs to be something that people are committed to. And that can either be committed to each other in relationship or committed to some shared external goal. But it's because of that shared commitment that that makes it worthwhile to struggle through disagreements. If people don't have that shared commitment, then when we come up to a disagreement, it's too easy for us to say, well, you're wrong, I'm right, and I'm just going to go my own way. It's the shared commitment to getting something done or the shared commitment to our relationships together in community that make us say, look, it's worth us spending time struggling with this, because if we are of one mind, we're more likely to reach the goal and we're more likely to flourish in relationship with each other. So associated with that is this sense that there needs to be a belief that we're cooperating, that we're not actually against each other. We're not in competition. We're not going to get one over the other. We're not trying to overpower. We're equals of equal value, all with a valid point of view, and that we're trying to cooperate in order together in a synergistic movement achieve that shared vision or achieve that flourishing sense of relationship with each other that we're committed to. That then leads to the necessity of earnest listening, not just listening briefly while we're waiting, while we're thinking about what we can say next, but earnestly, properly listening to what people are saying and to why they are saying it. What's their reasoning? How did they get to this point of believing something that we disagree with? How do they connect the dots to get to that point? And why is it different than ours? And what is the real point of our disagreement? Because often the surface level disagreement only exists because of some underlying assumption. And if we dig down and find out what that assumption is, where the logic branch first happened, and address the assumption behind the disagreements, we're more likely to get to the point of saying, oh, you believe that. Now I understand why you're making that stance or disagreeing with this decision. But let me help you understand that core assumption in a slightly different way, or show you why in this particular case I don't think that assumption applies, or whatever. Let's get to the real reason behind the disagreement. That, of course, slows down the decision-making enormously. If you're not just going to be able to vote and get the majority decision, but actually listen and work through what the core assumptions are cooperatively with a shared commitment to each other or to some common goal, the decision-making is going to take a lot longer. And that's one of the common complaints about consensus, is that it just doesn't get anywhere. It goes round and round in circles because you're never going to get people to change their mind. Why bother? Let's just get on and get the thing done, even if a few people disagree with it. But for true consensus, we really have to slow down and perhaps take years. As Catherine was saying, take a year about that decision about whether the congregation wants to be affirming of LGBTQI. In the case of anti-slavery work, the Quakers took a very, very strong lead in the US, but they only did it after 100 years of argument and disagreement, and working through the reasons for and against slavery. When they finally got to a unified voice on it, it was a powerful voice that made a significant difference to the social change that was needed to move away from the US dependency on slavery. A consensus decision, it's still possible, as Bruce says, that maybe a dissenting single voice you get to the point where you realize that this person is never going to change, and to move forward, we just have to accept that that one person can't be allowed to just block forever. There's another point of view that says, no, still, would we be happy to go forward with this decision when 99% of us agree with it, knowing that 1%, that some number of people are going to be deeply hurt by it? They have said that not only do they disagree, but they are horrified by the decision. They're not willing to go along with the majority decision. There's some deep reason why they just can't have a bar of it. And that if the decision is made, they're just out of here because it's an obnoxious decision to them. Would we be willing to take that decision knowing the damage to relationships and the hurt it might cause to that one person? And in some cases, that might be the case. In some cases, this deep disagreement might be a reason for that one person to realize, this probably isn't the right group for me. I voluntarily joined this group and I was committed to the cause. But when I see where everybody else is going and I see their assumptions and I see that they really want to do this thing that's abhorrent to me, maybe I realize that I need to voluntarily leave because this isn't the group I thought it was. Perhaps. So it's possible in a consensus process to enable even one person to block the decision. It could be that some people disagree with the decision, but are happy to stand aside, are happy to say, I disagree, but it's not such a crucial issue. I'm happy to go ahead with the majority. That's another position that goes along with the four that Catherine mentioned. I disagree, but I'm willing to go along with it. Now, dissensus processes can be either formal or informal, depending on the nature of the organisation and the nature of the decision you're trying to make. It is possible just to continually have informal discussions in the hope that everyone might agree. But there are possibilities of well-structured consensus processes that aren't just talking in circles and for people digging in their heels and not being moved at all by the things that they're hearing from other people. There are formal processes that get beyond just chaotic talking in circles. And I wanted to say a little bit about how the Uniting Church approaches this, because I think they have a good underpinning and a good set of formal processes for working through these decisions. This is a quote from their manual of meetings, which I'll read the full thing because I think it emphasizes the same things we've been talking about from an Anabaptist perspective, even though the Uniting Church is not Anabaptist. So when a council of the church makes decisions, it is aiming to discern the guidance of the Spirit in response to the word of God. Discernment is not something for which we can set down rules. It's very Anabaptist. But the processes we use to create community and to communicate in our meetings can themselves assist in the discernment process. This will be enhanced if people come expecting to be open to both the Spirit and to each other. There's an expectation, there's a coming to learn, to listen, that something new might happen amongst us. By creating and sustaining effective communications in the context of a Christian community, we will be more likely to discern the guidance of the Spirit and reflect this in our decision-making. That's not to say that community should be nice all the time. We're not just polite and agreeable with each other. We will struggle through pain and difficulty together, as well as experiencing the joy of open and honest communication, being unified in our brokenness, not unified in our triumphalism, being unified in our brokenness and our common identity under God. When members are left hurt or the community is broken, poor decisions are likely to be made and the church has failed to be true community. Pressure to make a decision while ignoring the hurt of some members is likely to lead to poor decisions. You might have some comments on that, which we'll come back to in the next discussion in just a minute. Now, the Uniting Church uses the word consensus to mean unanimity. They use the word agreement when there's a small number of people who are unable to accept the majority opinion, but who agree to stand aside. So that's the second of the four things that Catherine mentioned. If there are people who say, I disagree, but I'm willing to go along with the majority decision. That's not consensus according to the Uniting Church, that's agreement. And in the minutes of meetings, decisions will be recorded as being made by consensus or by agreement, depending on that condition. In the Uniting Church process, there are no proxy votes. You can't send someone along to the meeting and vote on your behalf because you are not present at the meeting where all the listening happens. It's important that it's the people who are there listening to each other, prayerfully listening to God, who go through the whole process, who are the ones who say yay or nay, not them just being proxies for someone who wasn't part of the conversation. In the Uniting Church process, there are three stages of consensus. There's an information session where the decision to be made is laid out. The pros and the cons, the issues at hand are all distributed so that people can read and think and pray about it. After that, there's a deliberative session where people come together to talk about how they're reading the information, to get some sense about whether we're on the same side, who is not happy with it, and what are the issues that we still need to deal with. And that might take some time in a large group, perhaps breaking up into small groups, to do that deliberation, to argue, to toss ideas around, to see if the proposal can be amended in ways that will be more acceptable to everybody. And then finally, there's a decision session where there still might be people who disagree, but we come to the point where we say, we've got the information, we've talked about it, it's time now to see if we are of a common mind or not, and if there's a way to move forward. Now, I use the Uniting Church here, but I must say I went and looked at the Mennonite World Council's website to see how they go about it. Is it the World Council or the Mennonite World Committee, conference? The Mennonite World Conference. I wanted to see how they go about it. And you know what they do? They give you a reference to the Uniting Church Manual of Meetings. So the Mennonite World Conference used this exact process that they stole from the Uniting Church. Well, they very politely borrowed from the Uniting Church. Now, I wanted to look a little bit at the third stage here, the decision session, and to show you an excerpt from the manual for meetings, which is a kind of flow chart about how you would make a decision in a group that's trying to come to a consensus. This is an excerpt from a larger flow chart, but you'll see that we start at the top. From all of the discussions, the deliberation, is there a possible consensus position? If so, let's propose that, and we'll check to see whether there is unanimity or not. And in the Uniting Church, that's done by everyone who's present at the meeting having two pieces of cardboard, a blue piece of cardboard and an orange piece of cardboard, and people can raise either the blue one to say, I'm cold to this idea. It doesn't thrill me at all, it makes me chill. Or they can hold up the orange one, which says, I'm warm to this idea, I'm keen to go along with it. So we test the waters, test the temperature of the meeting to check for unanimity. If everyone holds up the orange one, business is done. We can go down the left-hand side there to the bottom left corner. We declare consensus, and that gets recorded as a decision well made. If some people are holding up a blue card, then we haven't got unanimity, and we'll then have some discussion. We find out, we give those people the microphone, the people who are holding up the blue card, to give them an opportunity to say why they disagree, how strongly they disagree, whether they're willing to accept the proposal or whether their objections are quite important ones. And then there is some discussion around their disagreements. We try to get the people who are in favour of the proposal to explain something differently or add some more information that might change the mind of the person who's held up the blue card. And we might go around in a few circles there. We'll again say, now having had that conversation, are we now in unanimity? And if we're still not, after some rounds of that discussion, we ask the people who are holding up the blue cards, well, I mean, there's two cases here. It might be that the majority are holding up the blue cards, and so they're trying to convince the orange cards to not go along with it, or it might be that the orange cards are in the majority and they're trying to convince the blue cards to go along with the proposal. Whichever way it happens, if there are people still in disagreement, we can ask, are you willing to go with the majority vote? And if people say, no, I'm not happy to do that, then the next thing is, no, let's take the next one down the arrow. If the people who are objecting say, look, I disagree, but I've heard everybody, I feel like I've been listened to, and I'm willing to go along with the decision even though I disagree with it, then we move now to that second box from the left. Agreement is declared and recorded. If, however, there are people in the minority saying, I cannot go along with the majority decision here, if they make that decision, I'm out of here, it's just obnoxious to me, it violates my very core principles, then the next question is, do we really need to make a decision right now? Because it may be that we can delay the decision and have some further offstage discussions to clarify, to improve the proposal, to think, is there an alternative? Maybe the proposal's not quite right, we can reword it and try again later. If a decision's not needed now, then we might delay things and not make any decision because we're not in consensus. However, if the meeting decides that, no, look, there's a deadline, we can't put this off any longer, the moment's going to pass, we must make the decision tonight, then the group can be asked by the chairperson, shall we use a formal vote? And hopefully there can be consensus that we will use a formal vote. And supposing we get to that point, there is still this opportunity that we take a formal vote and the majority opinion will gain the day. And it's recorded as a formal result, not an agreement or a consensus. And it's not really celebrated. We got to the decision, but we know that we've left some people behind, and that's not perfect. But because the decision needed to be made, it was the best we could do. So there is a formal process if you wish to use it. Now, we've talked about the blue and orange cards. These are one way of just sharing the temperature of the room. There are other ways people do it. I've seen in some protest movements where people, there might be a large crowd deciding, do we continue this process or do we all go home? The up Twinkies goes like this. People hold their hands up and twinkle. That means they're in agreement with what's being proposed. And down Twinkies is very unhappy downward fingers, which means, no, I'm not willing to go along with it. That's very similar to the blue and orange cards. Catherine talked about having a 4-finger approach, which gives a bit more flexibility. There's a 5-finger approach as well. And there's also a 6-finger approach, well, a 6 option approach called fist to 5. And fist to 5, if I can find the right button to click, goes like this. A fist means there's no way. No, I'm out of here. I would object. I'd fight against this to my death. 1 means something like, look, I disagree, strongly disagree, but there's more talking to be done. 2, I've got reservations, but I'll go along with it. 3, yeah, that's fine. I'll go along with it. 4 means, yes, that's good. 5 means I'm absolutely thrilled by this. Now, you have to be quite careful about the way you word these options. And there are a lot of variations of a 4, 5, or 6 option approach. And the wording's important. In some of these fist to 5 voting procedures, I've seen 5, meaning not just I'm in strong agreement, but I will lead the way doing something about it. It's a commitment to be part of the action. So yeah, you have to word this in a way that makes sense to the group you're with. So there's a variety of ways for people to voice their opinion without it just being yes or no tick box with the majority rules. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. And now that I'll turn to the sharing off again, and we can have some discussion about how this might influence our decision making at various levels. Could something like consensus work in families between parents and children? I'd love to see if anyone's done that with their children. What about in our churches? And I'm particularly interested in how this might work in the AAANZ. And I'm interested in that for 2 reasons. One is that the AAANZ, that's the Anabaptist Association of Australia and New Zealand, our constitution is framed in an old-style voting majority rules paradigm. I find that a bit disappointing. that our core constitution does not even suggest that we should be making decisions by consensus. The second thing about the AAANZ is I tried to use consensus last year where we were thinking about producing an association statement on the referendum for the Indigenous voice to be written into the Australian Constitution. And we might, if we have time a bit later, talk through that process. But it was actually a troubling process because the people in the AAANZ had disagreements about it. And I think we haven't practiced ourselves how consensus works within our own association. We're not familiar enough with it to be able to do the deep listening, the slow decision making. In that case, there was a deadline. We had to make a decision to whether issue the statement or not within a limited amount of time, and that was an added pressure. But I think the AAANZ could grow towards a consensus model, but we're not used to it. We haven't tried it, except in that one case, to my knowledge. But enough from me. Let's turn that over to some discussion now. What did you think about the Uniting Church approach? What did you think about the orange cards, the 5 fingers, 4 fingers, fist to 5? Have you tried to do this with your children? What's your thinking through all of those issues?
Well, I'm glad there was a pictorial diagram of all the fingers, because I guess it depends which fingers you're using and how.
Yeah, one finger can mean something completely different if you're not careful. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a handout that we often use in workshops, and it's the high five technique, and it's essentially the same thing. It just spells out what each we do the 1 to 5. 1, it's too soon to make any decision, and 5 is I can give an unqualified yes to the decision. I'm excited or enthusiastic about it. So yeah, we've used that technique with a number of different groups and have a handout. There's and it you may be able to find it online. It's called A Vote for Consensus by Susan Shearhouse. It's called the high five technique.
Mm-hmm.
But we have that on as a handout. If anybody's interested, we could send that along.
We used that in prison, and it was really interesting how the guys took that on. In fact, they wanted a copy of it so that they could use that in other meetings that they had. Yeah. But I know of churches that have voted for welcoming a new pastor using the high five. And I know when we've worked as mediators or facilitators, if there are people that are 1 or 2 or 3, we realize that those are the people we need to talk to and listen to. The 4 and 5s already, they're really on board, but we need to do some questioning, to try and pull them out and hear what their point of view is, and why they're, so against it or just not ready to make the decision. And that usually is good for everybody because they often will bring up things that we hadn't thought about, another way of looking at it or another issue that is impacted by the decision.
Interesting. How does that work? Do you actually ask for all the fists and count them, and then the 1 fingers that count them, 2 fingers, 3? Do you have to keep a record of a count of all the different versions of voting?
No, the numbers aren't quite so important. So if anyone has got their fist or just showing 1 finger, then they are yet to be convinced. And so they have the power to say, please listen to me. I've got an objection. And so it's not a matter of how many there are. It's that the people who are yet to be convinced, or the people who are in the minority, are the ones who need to be given the next consideration.
Right.
A copy of your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah. Sorry, I saw that in chat.
That would be
Certainly,
lovely.
Maybe through Catherine, the newsletters, somehow. I'll send you a copy to Lucy straight away. But anyone who wants a copy of the presentation, we'll make that available somehow.
You sort of touched on this, Matt, but it seems to me that this process really relies heavily on skills in listening and conversation and asking good questions. And in my experience, most of us do not get taught that. Sometimes we do, and it depends on circumstances, and maybe certain families or relationship dynamics do that better. Maybe I know Dave has learned some of that through counseling. So we'll learn it through certain channels, but my experience has been that most of us don't, and most of us are bad at it, at least without a lot of practice. So what do you know of it, either from the Uniting Church or from other models that have very explicitly taught, and again over years potentially, conversation skills? I know that sounds really stupid. It's basic, but I think for the most part people are not good at that.
Yeah, I agree. And no, I don't know any little course program or materials that emphasize that point and teach people how to ask good questions.
It's the
good to see if anyone else knows.
It's the open-ended questions too, that you're not just funneling in on that person, but trying to open up what they're thinking, and so that we all hear from them. Earl looked like he was wanting to say something. Errol.
I've been sitting rather quietly, but I was involved in a process where a group of us, it was quite a large group initially, secular group. I think most were actually associated with the UK Labour Party, but we were trying to develop some progressive principles, and it finally got down to a group of about 8 of us, I think, because a lot of people just dropped out along the way. But they were trying a consensus process all the way along. But it was interesting because people will drop out because they felt they weren't being heard. And that was quite clear. But what I was just going to comment on is it got to the final session, and we had our 5 principles on the board, and I actually felt one needed to be reworded. And they were doing a voting by going and putting your vote on a whiteboard. So in theory, nobody knew who was voting which way. I happened to be a dissenting voice on one of the principles, because its wording didn't quite agree with me. And what I found awkward about it was the way it suddenly went from being, oh, let's now discuss this again, to who voted against this? And suddenly I went from being just a participant to being the bad boy. And that really hurt me. So I think one of the things about doing this is that you need to be very careful about how you approach that person who is dissenting. Now, it was interesting because I sort of said to them, look, I disagree with the wording, but if the majority is going to actually want this, then I'm just going to go along with it. And they just couldn't accept that as an answer. And I landed up in a very awkward position. And I must admit, if they hadn't in the end just sort of said, okay, we'll do it, I would have just walked out and sort of said, look, I can't go any further in this. But I think that point of just if they'd said, okay, what's the dissenting? Why is this dissent? I might have just sort of said, look, the reason I dissent to this is, and but if there is, etc., and we could have moved on. But it was so I think the approach is very important in terms of how you communicate to people who are dissenting or who don't seem to agree with the majority. How do you communicate to them that their voice is still wanted, it still needs to be heard? It's interesting because we took it back to the Labour Party's think tank Compass, and Compass just dumped it. They didn't want to hear. So we put in months of work, and it just got dumped, which was rather sad.
Yeah, very sad. Mm. Lucy.
Yeah, I think in situations like that, it goes back to something you mentioned earlier about I'll just lower my hand, scooting back to what is the unifying paradigm? What are the things, the core values, the things that we hold dear? Because if it was the things that we hold dear included listening and respecting to the dissenting voices, knowing that we might have, personal opinions or preferences, but the openness to really actually want to listen to the dissent. I think if that's one of the, stated core values that people understand when they join the group, that's important to communicate and to hold to, because it is very hurtful to be marginalized, particularly if there were some powerful, in inverted commas, personalities or loud voices in the group. So I think when we discover we are in a group that does value such, precious, gentle approaches, respectful approaches, it is a bit rare, like Catherine said. I think she was the one that said that. It is quite rare. But wow, when you know it, you really want to continue to be a part of that and support it. Because sometimes the minority, they might not even be the majority, but very vocal minority voice can push things through somehow, just because of a power dynamic that really hasn't been addressed. So it does take, in a sense, a wise facilitator to scoot us back to those core values and things that we really hold dear. And I think for Christian things, that cruciform pattern, and there is disagreement on, in a sense, what is Christ-like, but I think a lot of that is because these days the Western government, Westminster system or American kind of systems on this majority rule and having to push things through, quicker than they need to be, really have infiltrated into a lot of the Christian psyche, and especially, corporate church type organizations where it's business, they're business groups dispensing services, even though they do have a love and a wanting to serve Christ. But if they really analyzed what they were doing and how they were doing it, they would see that it departs from Christ's kingdom principles. So thanks for mentioning that, Errol. I think it opened up a lot.
Thanks. We need to round off soon because our time is gone. If there's one or two final comments, but we'll close in a minute or two. Mark.
One thing about how do you learn this process, I think the size of the group makes a difference.
Yes.
Like when I was looking at all the stuff about the Uniting Church, I was picturing a large congregation and going through a very formal process. I think consensus works better in smaller groups, even if they then feed back into a larger setting. But if you really want to have people hear each other, meeting in smaller groups. And one of the things that we found has been helpful is using like a talking stick. So in a small group, making sure everybody's heard, you pass a stick around and you can only talk while you're holding the stick or a stone or whatever, so that the loud people, the talkative people don't dominate and everybody gets a chance to say their piece. And then that may feed back into a larger one. But I think the smaller the process, probably the better.
I also think it's important for people to see each other. And I do wonder, when we're just looking at a Zoom, how hard it is to really hear each other and do that. If, at least in a congregation or people who are gathered one place, working from a circle where you are already having in a circle, you're not having one person in power and you're all looking from, like the pews at somebody up front, but then being able to see each other and how we carry those issues with us, so you can deal with compassion and thinking about the other. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Last comment then from Janine.
It's just a comment that I'm adding to Bruce's comment, and just listening to everything and the experience that we've had in attending these assembly meetings. And, you know, as Bruce shared that it's, you know, 51%. And at the moment, you know, so us Open Baptist people, we have a WhatsApp group. So it's where a lot of the pastors and there's only about 6 churches at the moment that are formally in the Open Baptist groups, but so many others are supporting because they're waiting to get their consensus with all their members, etc. But what's happening at the moment, and our phones keep pinging, it seems to be a time of the year that pastors have to put in a continuing ministry, Mark probably knows about this, some sort of form that they have to put in so that they're accepted and can continue as a Baptist pastor. But there's so much anger out there, you know, because they're all commenting with each other, what did you, and I said this, and I'm going to say that. And so here's a situation that is just getting totally out of control. And, you know, certainly a 51% majority does not work. It's anyway, that's just my comment, because we're in the thick of it. We're just witnessing it all happening in front of us.
Yeah, when there's the structural power dynamics and entrenched positions and people not willing to listen, consensus becomes absolutely impossible. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. We'll close now, and I pray that God will help us all think through how we might apply this in our own relationships, in our groups, small and large, that we can all be honest listeners and good question askers, and that we ourselves might be the promoters of that kind of non-coercive approach to conflict and decision-making that inspires those around us. So thanks for joining us today. We shall end now.